As it turns out, game design is hard. If you are new here, I'm making a road building and traffic simulation game using my own engine, something like City Skylines, but just about the roads. We left the previous devlog with the core gameplay loop where you gain rewards for building roads to certain tiles, which spawn cars that move on these roads. If all the cars successfully reached their destinations and didn't get stuck in a never-ending traffic jam, you get new tiles to build roads to on the next day. This gameplay loop is a result of many iterations of improving the game mechanics, which you can learn about by watching the previous devlog, and I still don't quite like it. It feels a bit arbitrary, or made up, or out of context, that sort of thing. So I started thinking about how I could connect the cars and tiles to something else to bring more life into them. Maybe there should be some kind of resources produced by the tiles, and the cars would transport these resources. For example, the farms could produce food, which could be then distributed to the houses using trucks. The farms need workers to operate, who will also drive to the farms using cars, and so on. I got fairly excited about all this until I remembered that this is about the third time I had this exact idea, and I've already ditched it before. The concept is fine by itself, but it transforms the game into something like an economic strategy. Don't get me wrong, I love this genre, but given that I'm planning to release this game in October, there is no way I will be able to design and balance such a thing in time. I wanted a simple game about roads, and an economic strategy isn't a simple game by any definition of simple, at least from the developer's perspective. Another problem with this idea is that it assumes that all the resource production stuff will not be directly controllable by the player. Remember, the game is supposed to be about building roads. Now imagine that you see a game with a full-blown economy simulation where you're just building the roads. It would feel like you're only allowed to play the boring part of a much larger and way more interesting game. Honestly, as a player, I would feel angry and cheated. I spent several more days thinking on what I'm going to do with the gameplay, and I came up with, literally nothing. So instead I decided to concentrate on testing the game in its current state, which required quite a lot of bug fixing and most importantly some UI. My relationship with UI is quite tricky. You see, from a programming perspective, user interfaces are incredibly complicated, and I love writing incredibly complicated code, so quite naturally I always use my own UI implementation instead of using some external library. I had a relatively mature UI library in my engine, but I've grown to hate it over the years and I wanted something entirely new. I've written a blog post a while ago describing the design of this library and what exactly I don't like about it. I had some big plans for a new shiny UI library, but as I started prototyping it, I realized that my ideas don't work as well as I have initially hoped. After spending about a week on this new prototype, I decided that I don't have time for that, and instead I'll keep the UI for this game as dumb as possible and just see where it goes. Of course, I ended up reinventing big portions of my old library, which kind of tells me that it wasn't that bad after all. By the way, if you are still watching, please wishlist the game on Steam. This is the best thing you can do to help me with its development. So yeah, the UI. Right now the game is always in a road building state, as if you have selected a road building tool and couldn't deactivate it. Most other actions in the game are performed using the keyboard, and all the important information is presented simply as text. Instead, I want some proper explicit tools like road building and road removal. I want buttons for all the actions so that the game is playable just with the mouse, and I want some decent way of displaying information to the player. I started with the tools. I had this idea that the player's toolbar will be at the side of the screen, with tool buttons sticking out of it. I sketched the buttons in GIMP and here's the result. This is a toolbar, so naturally only one tool can be active at a time, and the buttons behave accordingly. They don't actually do anything yet though. I wanted to make them spin much more violently when you select or click them, but this turned out to look needlessly distracting, so I settled on this slight tilt instead. Before implementing these tools though, I decided to work on something simpler first. I added two similar buttons on the left side of the screen, which toggle the tile grid and the traffic jams display. Then I added a proper road building tool. This was mostly a question of some code refactoring, since the game actually had this tool from the very beginning. The one-way road building tool was easy as well. In fact, it is exactly the same tool, just with different settings. Then came the road removal tool. Right now you can only remove a single road tile, and I wanted something better, so I needed to design a completely new tool for this. At first I made it so that you can simply select a bunch of tiles and all roads on them will get removed. However, after posting this on Mastodon, I got feedback from someone called Effie, who actually quite often gives valuable feedback on the game, which I am incredibly grateful for. So the feedback was that this road removal mechanic doesn't quite make sense. You should be able to remove individual patches of roads, not entire tiles. I did think of this before, but for some reason I thought it was too complicated to implement. However, this comment made me try to implement it nevertheless, and it turned out way easier than I initially imagined. And I agree, it makes much more sense and gives way more control to the player. Another useful thing I made was change how the road building tool behaves. The game doesn't allow sharp 120-degree turns on the roads, and the tool would quite often get stuck in the invalid road state, even when you simply touch the wrong tile by accident. Instead, I implemented a backtracking algorithm which tries to remove some intermediate road tiles in order to build a road to your desired destination. Now the algorithm builds a valid road in most cases, even if I just randomly move the mouse, which sounds like a huge user experience improvement. Then I finally had a few good ideas about the gameplay. One of them was about the logic behind spawning cars. Right now the cars are connected to virtual humans, each living in a specific tile and working at another fixed tile. I added this mechanic before in order to make the traffic flow feel more organic and predictable. However, as your city grows, the traffic becomes pretty much random anyway, while the mechanic itself requires a lot of code to support it. So I simply removed it and made the cars spawn with random source and destination tiles, like it was before. I didn't really feel any difference, while the code got much simpler and several weird bugs got fixed on the way. Another gameplay improvement I came up with was about the money. You see, I never liked the idea of having money as a resource in this game. It once again makes you feel like this is some economic strategy game, which it really isn't. But I still need some resource, some way to prevent the player from simply filling the whole map of the roads designed with absolute perfection. So I replaced the single generic money resource with several specific resources like road tiles, one-way road tiles, forest removers and building removers, somewhat similar to how it works in many motorways. I tried to play a bit more with the resource icons and their colors, but eventually decided to make them simply white, since this would make them fit much better with the rest of the UI. Then I started working on the UI for claiming rewards for built roads. One consequence of the new resources system is that instead of having a fixed reward for building a road somewhere, I can give the player a choice of two different randomized rewards, which gives a lot of new meaningful decisions for the player. Showing both rewards for each of the tiles cluttered the screen too much, so I made these buttons expand only when you move the mouse to them. I tried showing the buttons for the tiles that don't have a road yet using darker colors, but this didn't make them stand out as much as I hoped, so instead I implemented desaturation in the UI rendering shaders to make these buttons grayed out. I also realized that it would be nice to indicate if there are some problems preventing the cars from spawning, for example if there is no road to the car's destination. For now, I solved it by creating these error icons on top of problematic tiles, which also describe the problem in words if you move the mouse over them. Ideally, it should also show the destination tile somehow, but I wanted to finish the basic UI first. I figured that the game should also indicate that a road can connect to all surrounding tiles and not just the tile it passes through, so I highlighted these tiles when you're building a road. Unfortunately, a friend of mine who was playtesting the game said that these highlights look more like tiles where you can continue building the road to, so I'm still thinking about how to make it easier to understand. Continuing with the UI, I made a widget that shows the player's inventory. When you spend or gain some resources, they fly between this widget and the world. I'm honestly really happy with how satisfying this effect looks. I've also added district icons to the reward buttons, mostly so that they are not empty. Making the various district times matter enough for the gameplay is something I'm still working on. Previously I talked about traffic lights, which I've added quite early in the game, but I never found a good way to use them, and I didn't really update them since I've added the 3D terrain. Still, I decided to tie them properly to all the new systems. I fixed their rendering code so that they respect the terrain height, I added a corresponding resource type, and a special tool that creates and removes traffic lights. After posting this on Mastodon, I was informed that on real traffic lights the colors go in a different order, which sounds a bit embarrassing, so I fixed that as well. The traffic lights are a bit hard to see right now due to their size, but making them bigger would make their proportions weird compared to other stuff in the game, so I'm still not sure what to do with them. There was one subtle problem with visualizing the cars. All the car physics really happens in 2 dimensions, mostly ignoring all the 3D terrain. A car's position along the vertical axis and its rotation are only computed when actually rendering the car. However, in certain cases, specifically on curved roads with a large height difference, the cars looked a bit weird, as if they are drifting slightly.
I've been thinking about it for quite a long time, but only now I figured out the problem and fixed it. It had to do with the way the forward axis of the car is computed, specifically how I forced it to be parallel to the terrain.
I got sidetracked again. Let's go back to the UI, there are only a few elements left. First, the player should know how many cars have successfully reached their destinations during the day, because this is the player's direct goal. To show this, I added these progress bars that only appear once the player has a non-zero number of cars of a certain type. One of these score bars is highlighted to indicate that this is the type of cars that are currently spawning. The bar also changes its color based on how fast the value is changing. If there are many traffic jams and the cars take a long time to reach their destinations, this bar will turn yellow or even red to indicate that. I've also realized that the game doesn't show the player how exactly new cars are added to the city. So I've added these car type icons to the district reward buttons as well, indicating that a newly built district adds new cars to the score bars. The final piece of the UI was a time control widget, which is a fancy name for just 4 buttons in the corner of the screen. You can use it to pause the game, run it with normal speed, run it with fast speed, or just quickly warp to the next morning, which is when new tasks are spawned. With the UI being finished, the last thing I had to do before giving the game to a few playtesters was to implement saving and loading the game. I'm using a really simple binary serialization format, which is easy to write and read in C++. The hard part was to properly initialize all the game's rendering subsystems from a loaded state, since before that they just assumed that the game always starts from a blank state. And with all that finished, I gave the game to a few friends for the first real playtesting. I'm still gathering the feedback and I'll probably talk about it in the next devlog. There was one common minor issue though, which is the resource icons. If a road resource is used to build roads, surely a tree resource is used to build trees, and the wall resource is used to build walls, right? And the 3 dots resource is used for god knows what. So instead I made them look more like tools used for the job, a chopping axe to remove trees, and a construction drill to remove buildings from districts. I also changed the traffic light icon, hopefully it should be pretty obvious now. While I'm waiting for the playtesters' feedback, I wanted to address one more issue. You see, I made all the UI in GIMP by hand, drawing all the parts of the UI elements and hoping that they will look nice together. This process has many problems though. The UI elements ended up having inconsistent line width, shadow size and its darkness, they're not symmetric enough, and so on. If I decided to use different colors for the UI, I'd have to recreate all the required images, which sounds like a disaster. Instead, I wanted some formalized and easily configurable process of generating these images, and I decided that making my own CPU-based 2D vector graphics rendering library sounds like a lot of fun. It is based on signed distance fields, which are a way of representing a geometric object by the function of distance to this object's boundary. After a couple of days, I had a library that is capable of producing quite decent looking smooth and pixel-perfect vector graphics, which I then used to generate most of the UI graphics on the fly. Now I can change just a couple of values to tweak the appearance of the whole UI. It also enabled me to add these lovely bevels, which I think make it look much nicer. And that's it for today. I hope you like where the game is going. The next thing I'll probably focus on will be the actual gameplay, which will need a major update based on the playtesters' feedback. By the way, if you want to participate in the next round of playtesting, join the game's Discord server. I've started posting updates on the game there, and I'll also try to hang out there for fun. Don't forget to wishlist the game on Steam if you still haven't, and I'll see you in the next devlog. Bye bye!